briefly into Buxton and what we're doing there. And Anne's perfectly correct. I'm a member of the field club, and also I was a founding member of the biodiversity group that's based within the Civic Association. I don't claim to be an expert on biodiversity. I'm just somebody who's very interested in it. So hopefully I'll be able to answer questions at the end, but there may be some that we just all have to decide to go and look up to find some answers. So without further ado, what is biodiversity? I think there are lots and lots of definitions of biodiversity, of course there are, but one of the things I really like is this quote about when you look at a single thing in nature and you find it attached to the rest of the world. So it's really making the point that biodiversity is everything, including ourselves, that lives in this world, on this planet. And the more sort of factual one is the whole range of the different varieties of living things and systems on this earth, from animal and plant species to genes, ecosystems, landscapes. And the diagram at the top there is obviously, we have to remember that this covers the oceans as well as the land. What sort of state is biodiversity in? There are numerous reports now coming out internationally and within the UK that are pointing out that we are in a dire state, a real crisis of biodiversity. This is one of the leading international reports, independent of governments, but are appointed by governments to do this report on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So the key points here is that nature is deteriorating across the globe. And the rate of change, the rate of deterioration is unprecedented in human history. Goals that are being set by governments across the world cannot be met by the current trajectories. And we can only reach the goals that we're setting both in this country and internationally for 2030 if we start talking about transformative changes and across all aspects of our lives, economic, social, political, technological. Another report recently out, this one led by Worldwide Fund for Nature, which again puts it in perspective. So between 1970 and 2016, so less than 50 years, there's been an average 68% fall in monitored populations of mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, fish. And that rises, I mean, I find this figure incredible, to 94% fall in tropical subregions of the Americas. What's driving this? Conversion of grasslands, savannas, forests and wetlands, species being overexploited. I mean, I find that whole concept of exploiting species, and we use that sort of primarily, I suppose, when we're talking about the seas and fish, quite extraordinary. It talks about our sense of ownership of the natural world, I think, that we can exploit it. Obviously, climate change, a big factor, and also alien species, which are taking over areas quite rapidly. In the UK, this is one of the most recent reports, the State of Nature 2019. And again, it's talking about not just how much we have, the abundance of the natural world, but also its distribution. So the wealth of what we have has declined both in number and in the areas in which we're able to find things. And again, looking from the 1970s, there's been a huge decline. And this phrase, I think there has been no let up in the net loss of nature in the UK. It talks about the remorselessness of the process that's happening. And I think, again, we have to realise that prior to 1970, it's not as though that was a perfect state. The UK's wildlife had already been depleted by centuries, not just years or decades, but centuries of persecution, pollution, habitat loss. So I think it's very easy. I think each generation looks at biodiversity and says, oh, look, isn't this wonderful? This is what we've got. It isn't, because if you think back 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, there was an awful lot more of everything. So we tend to accept what we have nowadays as a starting point without realising the amount of loss that we've already suffered. This quote in the bubble, Professor Alistair Driver is the head of Rewilding Britain, and again his view, we're still going backwards on biodiversity. And looking at the red list species, in the UK, 15% have been classified as threatened, 2% already extinct. And again, if we're looking at the causes in the UK of biodiversity loss, agricultural productivity, use of pesticides, we know these things, don't we? Increasing average UK temperatures, pollutants, and then development and the pressure for development, not just on farmlands, but on woodlands and wetlands too. Not forgetting our oceans, what's happening there. I found these maps quite useful because they're quite graphic, showing what happened between 1900 and 2000. On the left-hand side, the red areas showing biomass distributions, looking relatively healthy. This is measuring tonnes per square kilometre of fish life, of sea life, and then looking at 100 years later, and the red has completely disappeared from the same map. So again, vivid demonstration of what's going on in the seas. And again, yes, affected by climate change, the warming of the seas, but we're back to this overexploitation of fishing. Plankton communities are changing in response to the warming seas, and that is, as you see from the pyramid diagram which I put up, affects everything else above that. Although some fish stocks show signs of recovery, again, there's been decades of unsustainable fishing, which persists today. You know, we talk about drag netting, don't we, and massive trawlers going in, just scraping the bottom of the sea. And also, we don't know yet, but we know it's not good. We don't know yet about other impacts on the oceans, such as noise and plastic pollution. Apologies in a sense for quite a long diatribe on how bad things are. So I thought I'd better put, is there any good news? Well, some, I think. I think there's agreement in the international and national reports that if we act radically and transformationally, we can start to reverse things. But I think the problem here is that governments don't tend to act radically and transformationally, even when faced with such huge and obvious problems. But public support for action is continuing to grow, and we're starting to get all sorts of movements and groups campaigning, say, for a greener recovery. The expenditure by NGOs is up quite considerably over the last 10, 11 years. And also there's been a large increase in time donated by UK volunteers over the last 20 years. We've also seen some woodland cover increasing, new wetland habitats. There's been work on moors and peatlands being restored, and on heathlands. And so in the Peak District, for instance, we've got the Moors for the Future project in that, and there's a lot of work going on in Scotland. We're also finding that major and new emerging organisations are starting to prioritise biodiversity. And at last, I think it's probably fair to say, many of these organisations are starting to share a common agenda. And this 30 by 30, protecting 30% of our land and oceans by the year 2030 is starting to be a common goal, and certainly being picked up by the Wildlife Trust. And also we're seeing a shift to support for public goods, i.e. paying farmers, for instance, for protecting and enhancing biodiversity on their land, as we're looking forward and moving with the emerging environment bill that's coming through. But again, even with this relatively good news, public sector expenditure on biodiversity, both in real terms and as a percentage of GDP, is down substantially. Also, the amount of money spent on the environment and improving environmental biodiversity pales into insignificance against the subsidies that are being put into more destructive activities such as fossil fuels, overfishing, use of pesticides. Economically, we're obviously in difficult times, and also there's a strong argument to say that actually measuring GDP is not a good measure if you want to enrich your environment, because it's much more of a financial economic measure than a well-being or sustainability measure. While we've got the Environment Bill coming through, it's still unclear what the proposals are going to be around environmental land management. And in essence, there's an awful lot to be done and not that much time in which to do it. The most recent report that came out from Parliament was the Environmental Audit Select Committee's report. And this is interesting because it's got 16 members, with a majority who are Tories, with a Tory chair. And although they acknowledge several things that are happening, like the emergence of local nature recovery strategies, the idea of biodiversity net gain being put in for new developments, i.e. You can't just go in and destroy biodiversity, or even put it back as it was, if that's actually possible. You have to create better biodiversity with new developments. That's the idea coming through now. There's also nature recovery networks emerging, and also nature-based solutions to climate change. So those sorts of things are acknowledged by the Environmental Audit Select Committee, as well as the UK's leading position on protecting 30% of the global ocean by 2030. But of all of the G7 countries, we have the lowest level of biodiversity remaining in this country. Existing government policy and the targets are not deemed adequate to address the rate of biodiversity loss we've got. And also, as often happens, I think, policy is not joined up across government, and biodiversity isn't adequately factored into policy making. So the committee concluded that the government's not on track to improve the environment within the generation, and also that its 25-year environment plan, although that sounds quite far ahead, isn't doing enough to change this. And also, although biodiversity net gain is a good idea, it's perhaps not going far enough. So why does it matter? I've sort of painted a bleak picture. Why does it matter? Well, of course, biodiversity, well-functioning ecosystems are critical for us, not just for the creature. I mean, you can make it, of course, you can make an ethical argument for just in their own right. Other creatures have absolutely their own right to live on this planet and share it with us. We don't have that right, I don't think, to destroy everything around us for our own good. So all these systems are critical for our existence, for economic prosperity, and for good quality of life as well. And obviously, you know this already, that they play an important role in providing food, energy, shelter, medicines, regulating the Earth's climate, sustaining water and soil quality, controlling pollution and flooding, very important role. And also just for our recreation and well-being. Study after study is now showing, isn't it, that our well-being improves the more contact we have with the natural world. So, big question, can Buxton save the world? Well, we can try, we can play our part, I think. Many of the reports, certainly the IPBES and the Wildlife Fund reports, highlight the importance of local communities taking the lead, with benefits for us in doing that, but also benefit for nature and for biodiversity as well. Questions that were about Buxton, blessed or blighted. I think many of us would feel that we're blessed to live in a beautiful area and a beautiful town. And I think if you look at the variety of what we have in this town, we have moors and moorland edge surrounding us. We've got rough grassland, we've got acid grassland, we've got woodlands, and we've got water and beautiful open spaces like Lightwood. But of course, we've got the River Wye running through the town as well. Also, there's biodiversity where you wouldn't necessarily expect it, and there's richness there. We've got a wealth of trees and private gardens and parks in the town. We've got recreational areas. Though obviously Hogshaw Wreck is maybe an example that I'll come back to about how things can be tricky. We've got schools both near to woodland and open countryside, but also schools taking action themselves. And for instance, BCA, along with Peak National Park and Transition Buxton, ran a very successful Buxton Wild Week in May and started another one in July before it had to be stopped because of COVID. But engaging with young people is extremely important. We've got things like Thomas Fields Care Centre, built on an area where there was good biodiversity and a particularly rich area for toads. But also we're looking to work with different institutions to see whether there are ways of improving biodiversity, both for people and obviously for the wildlife as well. And I put the back of the A6 there as well, because we've actually got colonies of swifts who nest in the houses around here. And so you can see biodiversity, you can see nature in all sorts of areas all around Buxton. So the summary, I mean, there's a long list, isn't there? We have woodlands, we have pavilion gardens in the Serpentine and the slopes, we have Lightwood, Fernydale Nature Reserve, Cunningdale, that beautiful little dale that runs down from the back of the industrial estate down to the A6. We're surrounded by moors, we've got the river, got large gardens, and also we've got brownfield sites, which are now some of the most wildlife rich areas that we have in this country. But I think blighted, you could also say, if we look at this map, this shows the national park in the green and the excluded areas, which obviously include Glossop, but in this context, more importantly, Buxton. So Buxton was specifically excluded from the national park. So if we think back to the reasons for loss of biodiversity, development, pollution, people, loss of habitat, and we look at the consequences of Buxton not being in the national park, we've got no designated landscapes or protected areas because of that decision to exclude Buxton from the park. So we have a 70-year-old developmental and environmental sort of conundrum because we've been the centre for much of the ongoing housing and business development, but we don't have any of the protections that a national park would have. And also, of course, we've seen significantly increasing numbers of people living in and coming to Buxton. When we decided that we needed to set up a biodiversity group and that we needed to do more in Buxton, because I think the trouble is with living in Buxton, you can argue, oh, we've got lots of biodiversity here, we're a beautiful town, everything's fine. But actually there were several catalysts for action. The Serpentine wildflower areas, originally planted about 17 years ago now, were under threat and were going to be got rid of, the area along the River Wye, which some of us thought was a great shame because they'd been there for a long time and the species that had developed there had adapted to the very wet conditions on the river. We also had Nestlé at the time putting in a pipeline, or wanting to put in a pipeline through part of the Triple SI in Cunningdale. And also they'd come into the picture as managers of the Lightwood area. And also there were land management changes at the Fernydale grasslands area, where the idea was to put in quite a large herd of cows onto what's been untouched land really for over 10 years. And then more recently, there's been the Hogshaw wreck situation, where despite the wreck not being in the local plan, the council have been proposing to put this land in for development. And Hogshaw itself, not just the wreck, as I said, many brownfield sites are now extremely rich in biodiversity. So many of us feel that the local plan is in need of revision, really, to look at where we build and where the repositories are of wildlife at the moment. And certainly it can be argued that much of the farmland now is so denuded of wildlife, where much of the brownfield sites are so rich with wildlife, that you could argue that building on the greenfield sites is better from a biodiversity perspective than building on the brownfield sites. So what are we protecting when we say that we want to do stuff to help biodiversity in Buxton? Well, these are just some of the things that we have around. We have lapwing. Again, it's very tempting to say, well, we've got lots of lapwing, we're fine. We do have lapwing, but the number of nesting lapwing has declined significantly around the town. And it's quite difficult now to find areas where the birds are successfully rearing chicks. If we go into Pavilion Gardens, they're almost right in the middle of town, isn't it? We can see dippers by the river, and there's all sorts of reports of people spotting things in the river. Somebody was wondering the other day whether they'd seen a water bowl. We're not sure whether they did or not, but who knows? Mountain pansies, again in Lightwood, very near to the town, and also up at Grinlow. We have all sorts of butterflies in the town. I'll talk a bit more about the detail of this. Green forest and moths, which are quite uncommon now, and the thick-legged flower beetle in Cunningdale. So we have all sorts of birds, flowers, insects, some of them nationally scarce, but all of them, I think, worth protecting. Looking in, I thought I'd go just into a little bit more detail about what we're seeing in Buxton. These are the latest figures we've got, which we came up with, I think it was 2020, not 2019. But they are the most recent figures that we have. So we have in Fernydale and Sherbrooke, which is obviously on the Harper Hill end of town, 124 breeding pairs of calling males of 31 different species, with 37 species present during the breeding season. So that's a nice range of birds, isn't it? But BCA Woods, 458 breeding pairs of singing males. The commonest being the robin, but looking across the different woods owned by BCA, Grinlow, well ahead there, if you like, in terms of breeding pairs. But Corbett, Sherbrooke and Gadley, all doing well as well. And if you walk into Gadley Woods and just stop and listen, you hear all sorts of things. And it's a place of great beauty. All of the woods are, I think. In terms of plants, Fernydale, we see 120 species there, including the trees and grasses. Now that's a rich offering that's there. And we're also doing moth trapping and moth recording, with over 200 species recorded in one back garden which adjoins Fernydale. And that's Lindsay Wakefield, who's the coordinator of the biodiversity group. Lightwood has become increasingly popular, especially over the last year, but it's a real centre for all sorts of birds and insects. I won't go through the whole list here, but you can see the sorts of things that are there. That previously a breeding site for red-listed nationally declining British birds. So these birds are all under threat. The grey partridge, cuckoo, common redstart, all these are declining, and they're birds. If you talk to Mark Cocker, who's the great writer about birds and a Buxton born and bred, just moved back to Buxton. He can remember seeing all of these birds when he was a lad growing up on Lightwood Road regularly. So he's really sad, as we all should be, I think, that these birds were once common that have now declined. But nevertheless, Lightwood still has, though again declining, wonderful birds like golden plover and lapwings, curlew, missel thrushes. There's still a wealth there, but we have to remember that this is a decline year on year from what was there previously. Also, obviously, at Lightwood, there are wonderful ponds which sustain all sorts of things. In the spring, I don't know, you may well have seen which I would call the cacophony of frogs and toads, but also newts there as well. And it's wonderful sometimes to stand by the pools and watch the dragonflies patrolling their territory and going back and forth. And when you hear them collide, there's this wonderful sort of screeching noise as their wings clash. It's just, again, wonderful, but 15 types of breeding dragonflies up there. And again, rich in butterflies, 4 biodiversity action plan listed, so declining and in need of protection. And lots of bumblebees, again, particularly the bilberry bumblebee. And you'll probably be familiar with Friends of Buxton Station, who are particularly fond of the bilberry bumblebee and doing a lot to raise awareness of it and the need for protection of it. Again, at Lightwood, the flora is excellent, with wonderful things like ragged robin, bee orchids, which sort of come and go. Bee orchids have this ability to be there one year and then not so much the next, but they're still there. And other orchids like southern marsh and common spotted. And again, just wandering through the pathways of Lightwood, you'll see the richness of the flowers there. Buxton is still rich in butterflies. The headline this week actually is because we're involved in doing weekly surveys of butterflies in different locations across the town. This week, Lindsay Wakefield and her son Rowan spotted over 800 butterflies at Fernydale on the walk that they did, which is just incredible. The last one we did in Cunningdale, which was just a couple of weeks ago, we spotted around 230 butterflies. So the richness at Fernydale was quite extraordinary. So we've had 6 years of butterfly surveying. It's led by Steve Orridge, I'm sure many of you will know or have heard of. And we submit our findings to Ken Orp, who's the county surveyor. And those figures then go into the UK statistics year on year. Grinlow, Lightwood and Cunningdale all have over 20 species of butterflies. And again, I was in Cunningdale last year surveying, and at one point there were so many butterflies we actually couldn't count them. And we stood there feeling incredibly blessed, really, because it was so beautiful. And when you do things like that, I think it's wonderful to appreciate the abundance. And then it's awful to know that these beautiful creatures are under threat, and have this terrible duality of feeling about it. And also this year has not been good for butterflies generally. Obviously Fernydale accepted, partly because of the very cold and then wet conditions that we had. And we didn't see numbers lifting really until later in June. The last few bits about who are we that are trying to take action to help biodiversity in Buxton. Well, I think there are probably 4 main groups, but then other groups as well. And I apologise if you're in a group that you feel should be on this page. I haven't tried deliberately to exclude anybody. These are just the ones that I know of and I'm involved in. So Buxton Field Club, we've been going since 1946, and we do a range of talks in the winter and the autumn on anything related to the natural world. And then we also do a series of walks and site visits throughout the summer. Our next one is on Saturday the 31st of July, where we're surveying the biodiversity in Serpentine Gardens. So if any of you want to come and join in with that, you'd be most welcome. We start at 10 o'clock. There's also, of course, the biodiversity group set within BCA. And you'll find, obviously, as with anything in Buxton, there are many people who belong to several groups. One of the things that we've done, perhaps most visibly, with the biodiversity group, is the new Wildflower Garden at Pools Cavern, which I hope you've seen. It's the one that's surrounded by the natural fencing, and we had great fun creating it, starting in the snow in January, and then building a natural wood fencing all around using a lot of the ash dieback wood that we dragged down from the top of Brimlow Woods, and we created the fence around. We then lifted all the turf off from that area, turned over all the soil, and then put in both flood plants and seeds, annual and perennial. And that's now starting to look quite good, actually. I'll say it myself. If you haven't already seen it, you might be interested to see it. And we also redid the herb garden, which is just outside the buildings at Pools Cavern. We've also produced the Field Club and Buxton Biodiversity, a biodiversity plan for the Serpentine, and that's why we're doing the survey on the 31st. We're hoping to put more up-to-date information into the plan. And we've submitted that to the council, and we're awaiting a decision on whether that biodiversity plan will be taken forward. And also we're campaigning on verge management, and so we've been talking both with Derbyshire County Council and High Peak Borough Council about mowing regimes and whether they can be changed to enhance biodiversity. The other groups in the Green Bubbles, the High Peak Green Network Biodiversity Group is a group that both I and Lindsay belong to, which covers the whole of the High Peak. We've got colleagues from Whaley-Bridge, Glossop, Hope Valley and Hayfield, and we're trying to coordinate actions and enthusiasms on biodiversity. And the views of that group go into the group in the bottom bubble, which is the High Peak Borough Council Biodiversity Group, which again I helped to set up along with Peter Phillipson from BCA, greatly aided by Jean Todd, who's the councillor with lead responsibility for the environment. And we've now got to a position where High Peak Borough Council, I think they would say themselves that they had no knowledge or expertise about biodiversity, and they've now agreed to create a biodiversity strategy for the council and all of its operations. So we're just at the start of that. Other things that we're doing on a smaller scale, we're trying to grow trees. I have about a dozen small oak trees which I've grown from acorns, which will be planted out at some stage. I mentioned the Buxton Wild Weeks, I think, earlier, so the joint initiative with the Biodiversity Group, Peak National Park and Transition Buxton to cover and promote biodiversity in schools. And I think the figure was over 900 young people had been engaged with in the Wild Weeks that took place this week. There's also the Buxton Hedgehog Project, and if you love hedgehogs, if you observe hedgehogs, if you have a hedgehog in your garden, please do log it, and I've put the link in there for you to log that. We're also, as I think I've indicated before, very involved in surveying and monitoring. Mark Cocker's particularly good on the curlew and lapwing monitoring, but we've been monitoring swifts. I was counting swifts last night along with half a dozen other people, and actions both to record in Buxton where swifts are nesting, but also to get more swift boxes put up. If you know if you know where swifts are nesting, or if you have swifts nesting in your garden, please get in touch with Simon Fussell at BCA. He's recording that. And then we're also surveying not just butterflies, but moths, birds, and flora. So, for instance, we surveyed the flowers that grow in Grinlow last year. Also, we're in touch, as I mentioned earlier, we're in touch with Nestle, who now have volunteering days at Lightwood. I think actually there's one, I'm not sure whether it was today or yesterday. So you can go along and physically help at Lightwood to improve the environment there. And also we're in touch with the University of Derby, who now have land at Cuckoo Tors, which if you go up Long Hill is on the right, just after you pass the Outdoor Management Centre as was. And we've got people from the biodiversity groups and the field club helping to monitor wildlife up there. We've also got people who are really enthusiastic about badgers, toads, peregrines, ravens, all sorts of flora. And we're always looking for people who have similar enthusiasms who would like to come and join in and help with that. I thought I'd put this slide in because a lot of people sort of say, well, what can we do to help? And I think there's been a lot of talk now, including from organisations like the RHS, about wildlife gardening. So I think, again, if you have a garden and you want to do something to increase biodiversity, there's all sorts of things you can do. This just shows you some for instances. Always good to put in ponds or water features. Always good to have piles of wood or bricks or stones that insects can go and hide themselves in. Always good to grow a whole range of different flowers and vegetables, and animals have all sorts of different things that they can enjoy or hide under or eat. Leaving grass mowing so that flowers will naturally grow instead of being cut off again and again by what some of us may think of as overzealous mowing. Leaving cracks in pathways so flowers can grow. Composting, of course, and not using pesticides wherever possible. So they're just some of the ideas that some of us can hope to attain. And I've tried this year my own garden, which is pretty small. We live on Hull Bank, so it's quite a small garden. I've tried to increase the number not just of wildflowers, but also not to keep the garden quite so tidy, to leave leaves when they've died back, to let things grow. And we've had a noticeable increase in insects and butterflies this year. The challenges ahead, moving baseline is this idea of, well, we're fine now, aren't we, without really realising what we've lost and what is still disappearing. So I think being aware of that is important. I think knowing where we want to get to, not just as a town in terms of biodiversity, but in terms of government strategy, what is it we're trying to do? Because if we're trying to really protect biodiversity, we have to do it a whole lot harder than we are doing at the moment. I think the key to being successful in Buxton is enthusing and informing everybody in the town, especially young people, and that's what the Buxton Wild Weeks have been trying to do. Working together, I think, again, we try not to reinvent the wheel, so I think partnerships and working together. And that was our aim with Highfield Borough Council, because they have an overarching responsibility in a lot of land. So if we can get them to have a biodiversity strategy, it might make a bigger difference than just one or two of us doing things in our gardens. So making common cause, working in partnerships. I think also we have to find ways of talking to people who we think might not be so in favour of biodiversity as we are. So I think we have to talk to landowners, and we have to talk to shooting syndicates, and to see where we can find common ground, and to work constructively together. And that goes for working with farmers as well. And the aim, I think, needs to be creating habitats, corridors that wildlife can use, so that wildlife don't get isolated into small cut-off habitats. Rethinking brownfield sites is another one, and then also, of course, how all of this may be funded. So if you'd like to be one of our enthusiasts, whether you're a complete beginner or an expert, please do get in touch with us. We'd really love to hear from you. I think I've probably talked enough. So thank you very much, and I'm really happy to take questions.
Right. If you want to ask a question, I suggest you unmute yourself. I've got a bit of a problem at the moment with the roof making a noise. So I'm relying on you to unmute yourself and ask your question. No one?
Sorry, have I just dinned everybody?
Well, I have a question.
Okay.
I was out walking near Peakdale, and I was, well, not exactly mobbed, but given the idea from a curlew that I wasn't welcome. I can't blame it. And I then came across some bird watchers. They were trying to take photographs of a twite. So I mentioned this to them, and I was horrified to find that the curlews are decreasing in number.
Yeah.
I asked why, and he said, because of the cutting of silage.
Yeah.
This cuts the grass, I believe, when the birds are nesting.
Yep. Yep.
Is there anything we can do?
I think I mean the one of the people who is really a curlew expert is, oh gosh, what's her name? She wrote Curlew Moon, and she talked at the festival the other day. Oh, and her name completely escapes me. But yes, I mean, to read her book is devastating, really, to know what's happened with the curlew and what continues to happen. I think her view, when she was talking about it the other day, was that quite often farmers don't want to be harming curlew, but they may not be fully aware of what's happening. And I think there's something, she would say that there's real room for engagement and discussion and information sharing about curlew. And certainly some farmers would leave a circle and not mow until after the chicks have reared. But I think it's a really difficult question about, is there anything we can do? I think on a smaller scale, there are things like keeping our own dogs on lead in seasons. I think I repeatedly see people who come into the area who don't keep their dogs on leads in the nesting season, and that can be massively destructive. So I think it's awareness raising, and again the monitoring that we're doing, so that because again I went to hear, I don't know whether anybody else did, I went to hear James Rebank's talk this last week as well at the festival, and he was saying one of the real problems, and he included himself in this as well, was that sometimes farmers just don't know what they've got in their land. And he said until recently, he was very much of the opinion that, well, I've got curlews, everything's fine. And then he said, well, yeah, and then I discovered, yes, I've got curlews, but I haven't got breeding curlews. And there's also a time lag. He said there was a time lag of 30 years between realizing that actually your curlews were really depleting in numbers and they weren't breeding. Obviously, the two are linked. But in that 30 years, he'd also destroyed habitats for the curlews. So I think it's a bit of a long answer, but I think it's about getting ourselves informed. It's about helping farmers to understand the dynamic of what they have on their land. Also about farmers trying to change their cutting regimes if they can.
Has anybody, oh, Alan's got his hand out, Alan Thompson.
Hello. Thank you for that. It was really interesting.
Oh,
I was ducking out from the view because I've got this golfer now. But anyway, I'll get over that. I've moved into this house about a year ago and I'm just settling it down at the moment. I've got past the point where I've grassed everywhere. I've also managed to increase the garden by the size of about a third. Your idea there, your picture a few slides ago, of what we can do in the garden coincides with me thinking about where do I seek advice to go and do something along those lines.
Yeah.
I grew up with parents who managed to cultivate an acre and a half, and I think that scared me off because I didn't want anything since.
Yeah.
So I would like some help really to do something along the lines you've got there. And what would be best use of the ground to do that. And I'm definitely at the stage now where I'm thinking of getting my plans ready for October time when I can start putting shrubs and bushes and things like that in. But your idea here has maybe extended a bit. So is there someone I can talk to?
Yes, I mean, I think, come and talk to I'm very happy to have a chat with you and to see either whether I can give you any help myself or whether there are other people in our group who can. Steve Orridge, for instance, he just took the approach where he wasn't going to mow his grass at all, and he's left it. I think this is now the second year he's been doing it. And so he hasn't done anything dramatic, he just hasn't mown, and he's had orchids and he's had vastly increased numbers of birds. Lindsay Wakefield has sort of gone mad in a sense, in that she now has, I think, 2 or 3 ponds, all sorts of different areas, different plantings. So I think it depends, and I hear what you're saying about maybe having been a bit perhaps overawed about your parents and what they did. So it might be that you want to take a staged approach and see how it goes. There is lots of advice online about gardening for wildlife, both from the RHS, but also from the wildlife trusts. But again, sometimes you can look at all that and it's a bit overwhelming. And there are also things like listings of just the best plants to use for attracting pollinators, for instance. So it depends whether you want to, go all out, big time, let's change everything, or whether you want to have a phased approach. But I'd be really happy to, talk to you to. COVID permitting, to pop round if that was appropriate and have a look at it with you. You might also want to have a look at the book by Dave Goulson called something like, can't remember what it's called, Jungle Gardening or something like that. Because again, he lists all sorts of plants and shrubs at the back of that book. I can lend you a copy of that if that was helpful.
Okay. Thank you. I'll probably take you up on your offer. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll do email me. I think Anne's got my email address, but it's on this presentation as well. I think it's on this screen.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. I actually wanted to know the source of that slide you showed of how you can improve your garden.
Yes, that's a good question. Where did I get it from? I think I don't. I should know this, shouldn't I? Seeing as I'm using the slide. It was either Plant Life or one of the wildlife trusts, I think. I can check for you. Sorry, I only nicked it the other night, and I thought, well, it might be useful to put it in. I'll let you know, Anna. I'll look it up for you.
Thanks. Anybody else? Other question? Viv wants.
Yes, that was very interesting indeed, and it's good to know that Buxton is a bit of a haven really for wildlife, and I've tried to make my garden a lot more wildlife friendly. The first big change was having a pond.
Yeah.
Very small pond,
Yeah.
but we have newts, we have frogs.
Oh, lovely.
I got a B&B for hedgehogs and stuck it in the corner and covered it in foliage and stuff.
Yeah.
And we have had a few resident hedgehogs. I don't think they stay there very long, do they? They just come and go.
Yeah.
But we have seen, not this year yet, but we have seen them. And I've stopped digging up every single weed, and they are now wildflowers.
Yes,
So
they are.
I have a complete mix of wildflowers and things that we all like a bit more colour and splash in the garden. So I have got some plants that I've bought, but I do let the wildflowers grow. Our garden's half in shade and half in sun, so I've got looked up to see what does well in each. And I've tried to go for native species as much as possible. I've stopped mowing the lawn in the early part of the summer. It's probably going to get mown for the first time soon because it is a bit long, but I believe that helps the insects. And I must say that, you know, just sitting in the garden, seeing all the bees and the butterflies and everything going on, and we have a pair of collared doves that come that I feed. I'm considering getting a dovecot. I don't know if anybody knows about that, but we've done everything we can so far, and there's still more to do. So the point is, it gives you enormous pleasure just sitting in the garden. You're not really up to dashing about, as I'm getting on that way. It's lovely to just sit in your garden and see all the wildlife. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I think that, thank you for that. That's so true, isn't it? And I think just to be able to sit and watch. One of the things we've watched this year, we had a blackbird family, and something happened to the mother, and the male blackbird went into absolute overdrive, feeding this enormous fledgling. The fledgling was bigger than the father, but he stuck at it and he fed and he fed and he fed. And as he did that, he was looking more and more and more raggedy himself. And we went away for a couple of weeks, came back a couple of weeks later, and he seemed to have disappeared. And we thought perhaps he's died because he was really working very, very hard indeed. Yesterday, we've spotted him. He's now got a second nest in the wisteria of our next door neighbour. And he's at it again. He's flying in with beakfuls of worms and just sitting and watching the progress of things in your garden. It's so rewarding.
Is there anybody else with a question? No? Oh, Ruth, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, I just want to encourage people with their lawns. I live just below Grinlow, and I don't have a very good depth of soil, and I have had two biggish lawns, and I'm now going to have to maintain everything myself. So in an effort to reduce management, I've had one lawn made covered in bark chippings and some big lumps of stone and evergreens, and it's looking quite nice. It's coming on quite nicely. It looks a lot better. The other lawn was cut. Someone came in and cut it for me, cut right down low to take out all the moss, which is moss was about 6 inches deep because of all the clay. And then we sowed it with wildflower seed, and now it's a delight. It's covered in cornflower, corn cockle, what we used to call eggs and bacon, all sorts of flowers that I don't actually know yet, but all wildflowers coming up. It's going to be mown in a month or so, and then just laid there for the seed to drop down into the ground again so that it still grows. And that's how it's going to be. It's just got to pass through. I've got an area that I mow through so that I can get from one side to the other. It's an absolute delight.
That sounds really, really wonderful, and a really good idea to let your seed go back into the ground. What I would recommend is, though, that once the seed has dried and it's gone into the ground, take off the remaining thatch. Because your wildflowers like poor soil, and if you let the thatch drop down into the soil, it will enrich it again. So once the seeds have been shaken out, if you like, it's quite a good idea to remove the thatch.
That's it. And then that's in another hedge, the pine or conifer hedge. The soil is very poor, so that can go in a heap. For any animal that wants to go and live in.
Lovely. Yes, heaps are good, I think.
Oh, and the other thing that I got ready yesterday, actually, oh God, it's comfrey liquor. Does anybody else make that?
No.
To water their vegetables. I don't know if you remember Stefan Luchatsky, just beyond the Gardener's Question Time. He recommended it, and you take your comfrey leaves, dump them in a bucket. It stinks to high heaven, so put it out of the way. And then you put a very dilute solution on watering your plants, because it's so full of nitrogen.
That sounds good. I've got a wormery which produces liquid as well, and you then dilute that down 10 to 1 and does the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're having fun.
Yes, you could call it fun, yes. Yes, it is actually. It's lovely just to sit and watch something and just watch how many insects are around and come and visit.
Right. Any more questions? No.
Say thank you, Rachel. That's inspired me to do something with my garden.
Oh, thank you.
I wasn't going the biodiversity group, but I will now.
Yes, very good. Thank you, Alan.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. As you can tell from the questions and the interest, that we are thinking of it. We are trying to do things. I particularly want that screen you had, because my daughter has got a new garden and she wants it to be friendly to wildlife, as long as it's not too big. I don't think she fancies a badger. So thank you again. I'm sure you'll email me the details and I'll forward them on to everyone. We usually thank by clapping. So would you like to join me in clapping, Rachel?
Thank you.
Absolutely. Very good.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And if anybody does want to get in touch, please do. You've got my email address. That's
I've got it if you can't download it. Okay then. Well, we're not having a meeting in August. We're having a rest. We're starting